All right, ladies and gentlemen, first week, we're going to look at the United Nations. Now, the United Nations is the mother of the mother of the mother of all international organizations, right? It is the largest international organization. And quite frankly, it's amazing that we've managed to do this and maintain this for such a long time. If you take into consideration how much countries fight and disagree with each other and how much tension they have with their own, issues at home and manage to find more issues overseas, it's amazing we didn't break it up because, well, actually we did before. The precursor to the United Nations was the League of Nations, and that failed. There was an utter failure, and then they recreated a new one, right? Scrapped it, built a new one, called it the United Nations, and that somehow managed to survive now. And more than that, done some pretty awesome things, right? But still hasn't done some other things, and maybe that's just our problem. We always want to keep more. We want more and more and more and are never satisfied. Or maybe there are some serious failings that it needs to address. And that's pretty much what this debate is about, right? The debate that the UN has failed to meaningfully contribute to the world's largest problems. And the motion is worded pretty interestingly. It's quite broad, but it's basically asking you to assess the value of the UN, right? And that's the first thing we need to be cognizant about here, right? So before we get into the debate and the strategy, this is a debate about assessing fact, okay? So this debate is about whether something is or isn't, not asking you to propose something, okay? So it's really important for you to provide a standard. You don't have to provide a proposal. You don't have to reform the UN or ban it or abolish it or anything. You just have to evaluate it, right? So let's look at something, and based on what something is it or isn't that, right? Now, think about how you would evaluate anything. For example, if you and your friends were having a discussion about, I don't know, maybe a movie, okay? So is this a good movie or a bad movie? And you'd say I think it's a good movie. Why is it a good movie? Because it has X, Y, and Z. Why is it a bad movie? Because it has X, A, B, and C, whatever. But then you'll say well, how do you know which one of these criteria is more important? You need to classify the movie. You need to provide some standards. So, yeah, it's a horror movie, right? So every horror movie needs to have these things. And in order for these things to be good, this is how you measure those things in the horror movie, right? So it needs to have a pretty scary element. It still needs to have a storyline. It needs to have some good special effects. Let's say those are the three things. What do you mean by good special effects? What is the good storyline? So you develop those standards in order to classify and to measure. And then you can say okay, so now let's look at all the facts, right? After you have those standards. Now, that tends to be the big problem with debates like this, right? Where people just jump to all the facts and say the fact, and then another fact, UN did this, UN did that, UN did this, UN did that, without providing a way to measure one fact against another fact, without saying how this fits in that big picture, okay? So that's the first thing you need to think about. How do I draw this standard, right? So let's do this together. So basically a debate about the effectiveness of the UN, okay? Measuring the effectiveness and the value of the UN. Just keep that in mind, and then we'll get to the rest of the stuff. Now, which words here do you think are the trickiest ones? These are the words that will give you that standard which you're trying to get, right? There are two sets, or two phrases. One is this, meaningfully contribute to, and the other one is this, the world's largest problems, right? Now, from government, so I'm trying to say that they failed to meaningfully contribute to the world's largest problems. So for me, it's better if I show the UN has less value, right? So they've been less successful. So I have a higher standard of meaningful contribution, right? I think that contribution needs to be decisive. I think that contribution needs to have some kind of real big impact, right? Because I'm trying to make life hard for the UN. I'm a critic of the UN. So, small things are not good enough for me. I want something meaningful. what is meaningful and what is to contribute is pretty big, right? And similarly with the largest problems, I want to pick the most controversial ones, the biggest ones. If there are more problems for me on Gov, the better, because then it's easy for me to show that they have failed to do this. On Op, my view is, not surprisingly, reversed. I want to have a smaller, more concise, lower bar for meaningful contribution. And I want to focus the world's largest problems. Okay, I don't want to have such a long thing for the world's largest problems. Of these two things, which one you think is going to be more controversial in the debate? Which one you think is going to have a larger, more contention? Now, you might end up spending a lot of time talking about which problems should we pick. Should we pick, conflicts? Should we pick environmental issues? Should we pick refugee issues? What about poverty issues? Or what about a specific conflict that we should pick? Maybe it's easy to show this, or it's hard to show that on the other hand. Lots and lots and lots of problems. But I think this is not going to end up being the most controversial or contentious. Because if the government side does a reasonable job picking a problem, and it doesn't make sense for you, an op, to attack it, right? So if in government, I decide to give you 3 problems, and they're all pretty big ones, like conflicts or environment or poverty, you can't expect op to go like, I don't think poverty is the world's largest problem. I think environment is a world's even bigger, larger problem. It doesn't make sense. You're going to end up losing that debate, right? If the burden is to show that poverty is not, or doesn't qualify as a large problem, right? So that doesn't make sense. So pretty much whatever things you pick, or even if op wants to bring up something else to show that, hey, they managed to do that, it's going to be a pretty reasonable thing here, right? Because it doesn't say the world's largest problem, it says largest problems. So it's 5 or 6 of the major things, everything qualifies, right? I think the trickier thing to do is to do this. How do you assess meaningful contribution? And the debate's going to come down to that. It's going to say, at which point is enough? Is it enough for you to, say, start the discussion going towards the solution? Or do you have to take it halfway there, right? What is clear from the start is it didn't say solve. So it's not a debate about whether or not the UN has solved problems. So it's quite realistic in that sense, but also still pretty vague, right? So it's about, this is the start of a solution, and this is the end where the problem is solved, right? So here it's solved, and here we start. At which point at the problem do you need to be before it's meaningful contribution, right? On government, I think meaningful contribution should be pretty high, right? Because, I want to show that they failed. So I'll say like, hey, before you meaningfully contribute, you need to swing it over towards the solved side, to the level where if you back off, it's fine, it's solved, right? On op, I'm going to say, no. Start the conversation going, guys. Get us moving towards a solution. If you don't get us moving towards a solution, it doesn't matter. We're not going to get there anyway. And at least they can start it. Once they start it, other people pick it up. So this is going to be a tension a little bit in the debate, right? At which level, which area is it going to be solved, right? Now, as the teams, you need to engage the other person's framework as well. Once in a while, you need to say that, so on Gov, I'm going to say that this movement hasn't even happened. Sometimes, or in some situations, the UN hasn't even moved you towards a problem, towards getting that solution. And on op, I'm going to say sometimes that, yeah, this benchmark has been reached. Some of these problems are on the verge of being solved by the UN because of the UN's efforts, okay? That's pretty much your contention. So I'm going to get a little bit more specific with this, but I hope you're beginning to see what the important part of this debate is, right? Okay, so let's, to kind of quantify the standard, that's an R, a little bit, I'm going to put two things as part of my standard here. One is that, that the UN is largely and directly responsible. So other than the level of the problem that we talked about earlier, so this thing still applies, okay? To what extent? Where is the problem now, right? Is the problem at the start or is the problem at the end, right? But even then, the UN has largely and directly affected the problem. So even if you show that the problem's solved or solving, it has to be because of the UN, not that it's happened on its own, okay? And that the problem is on the way to being solved. Okay, so those are my two standards with meaningfully contribute. That it has to be the UN that's doing something, and the problem is here, on the way to being solved. That's too small for anybody to see, including myself. So I just put a big, yeah, here, bad, right? So I'm going to say it's going to be there. That's my proposal from Gov. Okay. My position on the UN. Okay, and this is going to be an interesting thing also, because I don't think it helps you on Gov to come out like a UN hater, right? Because then the more you piss on the UN and you kind of destroy them and you say they're completely useless, it's actually easier for OP to show some value, because you've brought the UN down so low that even if I lift it up a little bit, I'm making it seem more positive than you are making it seem negative. So it actually helps you to have a more balanced view of the UN, right? So you say like, look, I'm not hating on the UN. I think it's a wonderful concept. These guys are all pretty cool, although they, earn a lot of money and some of the money can be used to solve poverty. But anyway, I think it's a wonderful thing and it needs to do good things and it has a great potential to do things. I think we need to have higher standards on the UN. So I think we need to reform the UN. We need to push it forward. We need to encourage it. Come on, go. Not have low standards, right? So you accuse the other side of being too satisfied with the low bar that they set on the UN. You like the UN, you want to set a high bar because you think the UN is capable or the UN should be, and you want to push them to achieve more things, okay? So I think that's the most strategic position you can take on Gov, right? It's because it's not crazy. It's the most reasonable. I think most people are going to buy it. And you don't have to take on huge burdens of like abolishing the UN or a world without the UN, which it's pretty hard to imagine. And even if you think has some value, it's a big area to persuade the judges on, and unlikely you're going to be able to do it within the debate. Okay? So that's on the position of the UN. Now, let's get to the argumentation, which is the interesting parts. So, what problems should you pick? I think it's good to pick like a set, right? So I would pick maybe conflicts, pick poverty, pick environment, because it just say problems, and these tend to be the biggest problems that we're constantly going to engage with and not really end up solving. But remember, the bar is meaningfully contribute, right? So I'm going to pick these things, right? I'm pretty sure the op's not going to disagree with them. And then I'm going to say how the UN has it. And remember my standards earlier, not largely and directly address these things. And these things are not anywhere close to being solved, right? So I'm going to portray them as far from being solved. If anything, stable or getting worse. I'll say the gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger and bigger. The environment is, degrading and faster. And there are more and more conflicts, right? We don't seem to be able to get any kind of conflict alleviation or any kind of pause in the fighting. That's going to be my first position. And second, I'm going to say, even if there's any on this reduction, it's not from the UN. It's not because the UN did it, man. It's other people doing it, right? Like most people coming out of poverty the last decade have been in China because of the amazing work of the Chinese government lifting people out of poverty. It's been trade, it's been individual countries, it's been NGOs, it's been external UN actors that have been bringing positive value to these problems. Not the UN, right? That's going to be my position. So let's nail down the argument. Those are my problems. So this is the thing. So I'll show that the problems are worse. Problems have gotten worse. I show that the UN actions have failed. So a lot of these parts will require you to use facts, right? To have some details and discuss these things about the UN. Okay? So a lot of these things need to come up first, show how the problems have worse and failed, and provide some analysis around this, right? So don't just drop all these facts. Say why, because the nature of the UN is they will never be able to do more than what they're doing now, right? Because the UN is not disruptive. They are just like a platform for discussion. So the real change, anything disruptive, right? Anything new, anything cutting edge, anything will come outside of this, right? Outside of the UN. But the UN is very stable. The UN is very mainstream. The UN is afraid of change. The UN maintains status quo. Okay, so that's your kind of argument position with the analysis to show why that change is not going to come. And then you can talk about where change is coming from outside the UN, right? Because you don't want to paint a world that's all dark and bleak and everybody's dying and there's no positive value. And it gives you some strategic cover for people who talk about change here. Talk about private enterprise. Talk about individuals, right? Talk about the change. So where we've seen change in the environment is people developing, car battery, electric cars, people developing new technology beyond the UN, right? Where we've seen changes in, conflicts or poverty alleviation have been from individual governments, people who've taken leadership roles to try to address these issues, not the UN, right? The UN later will co-opt them and bring Malala in to do something and talk to people and pretend like they were part of it all along, but they didn't do anything, okay? All these things happened outside of them, okay? So I think that's the position you take on Gov. Keep in mind your standard. Talk about these issues. Connect them to all of the different things you talk about. Don't get carried away with the facts. Come back to your standard and show that the UN has failed, right? Remind people that, hey, I'm not a UN hater. I'm just trying to be real. And because I love the UN, I want it to change and I want it to improve. And I think that's the most strategic position you can take on Gov. But what about OP? So you take that same standard. I think that standard's fair, but you try to lower the bar, right? So you portray the different question you ask on OP is which part is harder to do, right? What requires that push to solve a problem? How are we going to solve a problem if we don't know that it's a problem? If someone doesn't remind us that it's a problem, if someone doesn't constantly advocate and push for that problem, and that's what the UN does. The UN makes these issues central to our civilization, to human society. It reminds us that we have to solve an issue with poverty, that conflicts are still ongoing, that, blah, 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 all of these different things, the environment. The IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change, is a UN organization. And they're doing all these amazing, amazing things, right? So you look at the question of a problem, how to solve a problem, and where it starts. So that's our scale. You talk about the value of starting things, because you also be realistic. You know that it's hard for you to show that the problems have been solved, right? That's not your onus, and remember, but it's also hard for you to show that the problems are almost solved, okay? Because these problems are intractable. It's unlikely that we're going to solve most of them anytime soon, right? Poverty, can you imagine at any point solving a problem as complex as that? Like on a global level, within countries, even developed countries struggle. America has huge issues with poverty, right? How are you going to solve a 6 billion person problem? You can't even solve a couple of 100 million person problem when you have all those resources. So it's incredibly challenging. Let's not get so optimistic, and let's not put this incredibly ridiculous and incredibly high standards, right? So if you say you love the UN and so on, then be realistic, work slowly, think long term. Because if you put too much pressure, people are going to give up, right? If you put too much pressure, people get demotivated and deflated and feel like it's never going to happen. So realize the importance of the work you're doing. These things are really, really important. And then you keep doing it more and more and more and more and slowly keep moving up, right? So that's the position that you would take on op. This part is super duper important, and obfuscate, well, merge the role of the UN into all the different aspects of problem solving, right? Say that on Gov, you're saying they need to be directly responsible. On op, say they need to play a role. They're playing an important role. They're not just like a bystander, but they are facilitating this to happen. And without the UN, most of these things would not have happened. So even if they're not decisive, right? So I'm not the striker scoring the winning goal, but I'm the defense. I'm the midfield. Without me, the ball would have never gotten there in the first place. And so that is a meaningful contribution, right? So you try to reframe a little bit what you mean by meaningful contribution to play an important role in there, okay? From an argumentation level, I think the two major things that you can do, one is talk about the wider role of the UN, like as a platform, okay? So the same kind of the negative interpretation that of Gov, that is just a platform, spin it and you say like, it is the platform, right? It is the place to take something. Once the UN picks something up, it becomes really, really important and it becomes mainstream. And every country knows about it and every country works on it. And then every country tries to integrate that into their legislation and their law, and so on and so forth, right? So even if something later needs to become a law and stuff, it'll be impossible if the UN didn't get a role in it, right? So the platform for discussion, it provides the political will, there is awareness, UN makes it, allows these things to happen, right? And the second thing is talk about the value of the UN as a symbol, right? As an actor. It creates pressure to create change. It's a wonderful kind of role model and leader, right? The UN, when the UN steps in, it makes some people feel safe, right? People trust the UN more than any other international actor, more than some countries, right? So even if you feel like UN is not decisive, it's not going in there and solving problems, but the UN still has a great amount of respect and value. It's like this really old guy who can't go in there and, kick somebody's ass, but when you come in and say, listen to me, then people will listen to them, right? So you say, that's still really, really valuable, and that's something that the UN does well, okay? And you try to use this a bit strategically, right? So when they, on the Gov, are asking for decisiveness, like intervention or sanctions or something, you say like, that's not how the UN does things. The UN does things like this and like this. And it's almost a good thing that they don't go in there and kill people, right? Because, compare the UN to America. Many countries distrust America's motivations and intentions. And America comes to a country and says, hey guys, I want to help you. They're like, hey dude, you killed a lot of people and I'm not so sure. But when the UN comes, they'll be like, I'm not sure whether you can do it, but I trust you. But you're alright, you're cool. And that's how the UN creates change, because it's this incredible symbol of power. Okay? And peace and all of those things. On op, you're not sure what world's problems they're going to take, but you should still prepare for something. And I think you should talk about conflicts or world peace. Right? This is going to be the most obvious one. If Gov doesn't pick this, you can always still bring this into the debate. So even if Gov says, I want to look at the problem of environment, poverty, and gender, really, really important ones, you can still come up and say, yeah, that's true, but we're going to say, like, look at world peace. You can't ignore their contributions that they've made or the contributions they've made to world peace. Okay, so this is, if you prepare for this, you can always bring this into the debate. And if they bring this into the debate, it's good for you to prepare for this anyway. But you're like, hold on, wait a minute. You want us to talk about world peace, but they failed to do this world peace stuff, man. Yes and no, guys. And this is where the standard setting stuff becomes important. The question is, what is the expectation upon the UN? Are you expecting them to go in there and intervene, to launch wars, to kill all people? No, of course not. Because that's bad for the UN. If the UN was like this major military force, it's going to lose a lot of its other positive value. And here you talk about how it has contributed, right? So you talk about its contribution in terms of nation building. Talk about the contributions in terms of peacekeeping. Not peacemaking, but peacekeeping, right? The role they play in negotiations, in resolving conflicts. So after the conflict, or at the point at which the conflict is like, tapering off, maybe when the fighting's done or finishing, the UN steps in to keep the peace. The UN steps in to build new nations, to educate people, right? To alleviate that poverty at that level, which is really, really important, because that's what stops the conflict from happening again and again and again, right? You need to build and integrate societies, and only the UN has the power to do that and the track record to do it, right? They are actually engaged in hundreds of peacekeeping operations and have successfully transitioned societies. Cambodia and East Timor are two very popular or relatively good examples, right? The UN Transitional Authority for Cambodia and the UN Transitional Authority for East Timor. And they formed like an organization, and then the UN went there, brought lots of people, trained government bureaucrats and officials, conducted free and fair elections, and now transitioned that country into a much better state, right? Not maybe full-blown, full-fledged democracies. Both of those countries are kind of like autocracies now, but they're on the way towards it, right? And no one else could have done something like that. Compared to any other individual country actor, it's become colonialism, right? And it's been a lot, huge failures compared to what the UN has managed to do. So you can prep, I think, a good argument for how the UN has created a more peaceful world from the perspective of building nations, and then prepare that on op. So, on the face of it, still a pretty, challenging debate. But this is what debating is about, guys. You want to talk about the big things, you want to talk about the world, then you need to be able to discuss the UN and whether or not it has worked or has not worked, right? And I think preparing for, practicing, researching this debate will give you two important, valuable skills. One, how to do debates about fact, how to set these standards and use the standard in the debate and not get carried away with that actual fact. The second thing is, of course, learning about the UN. Learn about some of the positive things, negative things about the UN, and learn how to contrast and measure them. You will do me proud by watching this video many times. You already have. Good luck, boys and girls, children of all ages.